Good day, everyone. I am Ace, and together with my group mates, Chapter 12, which is International Theory and Development Strategy, will be discussed. So, to officially start, let us first talk about why globalization is one of the most frequently used words regarding development, trade, and international political economy. Next slide, please. As the form of the word implies, globalization is a process by which the economies of the world become more integrated, leading to a global economy and increasingly global economic policymaking. For example, through international agencies such as the World Trade Organization. For some people, the term globalization suggests exciting business opportunities, efficiency gains from trade, more rapid growth of knowledge and innovation. And for others, however, globalization raises troubling concerns that inequalities may be accentuated both across and within the countries, that environmental degradation may be accelerated, and that the international dominance of the richest countries may be expanded and locked in, and most importantly, that some peoples and regions may be left further behind. Thus, globalization carries benefits and opportunities as well as costs and risks. Next slide, please. Some key issues of international trade and finance is that many developing countries rely heavily on exports and imports of primary products such as machinery, capital goods, intermediate producer goods, and consumer products. Furthermore, markets for these exports are often unstable. Therefore, primary product export dependence carries with it a lot of risk and uncertainty. In addition, many developing countries suffer from chronic deficits on current capital accounts, which depletes the reserves, causes currency instability, and slowdown in economic growth. Next slide, please. Now, let's focus on traditional and more contemporary theories of international trade in context of five basic themes or questions of particular importance to developing countries. First, how does international trade affect the rate, structure, and character of economic growth? So, this is the traditional trade as an engine of growth controversy, set in terms of contemporary development aspirations. Second, how does trade alter the distribution of income and wealth within a country and among different countries? Is trade a force for international and domestic equality or inequality? In other words, how are the gains and losses distributed and who benefits? Third, under what conditions can trade help a nation to achieve its development objectives? Fourth, can a developing country, by its own actions, determine how much it trades and which products or services it sells? Lastly, in the light of experience and prospective judgment, should a developing country adopt an outward-looking policy or an inward-looking one, or some combinations of both? Note that the answers or suggested answers to these five questions will not be uniform throughout the diverse economies of the developing world. Next slide, please. So, what are the importance of exports to developing countries? Exports of developing countries are less diversified than those of developed countries, and developing countries are generally more dependent on trade than developed countries are. Moreover, among developing countries are more dependent on foreign trade than most relatively large developing countries. Next slide, please. Let me present to you the demand elasticities and export earnings instability. So, in low income elasticity of demand for primary products, a 1% increase in mostly developed countries' income leads to an increase of imports by less than 1%. On the other hand, in low price elasticity of demand for primary commodities, a 1% decrease in prices leads to an increase of imports by less than 1%. Together, the two elasticity phenomena contribute to the export earnings instability. Next slide, please. Let us tackle the terms of trade and the Previs-Singer hypothesis. In here, The total value of export earnings depends not only on the volume of these exports sold abroad, but also on the price paid for them. If export prices decline, a greater volume of exports will have to be sold merely to keep total earnings constant. Similarly, on the import side, the total foreign exchange expended depends on both the quantity and the price of imports. Also, previous singer think that less developed countries need to avoid a dependence on primary exports. This has been Ace, and I am giving the floor to the next reporter. Thank you.
Now, let's talk about the traditional theory of international trade. But first, let's answer the question, why do people trade? People usually find it profitable to trade the things they possess in large quantities relative to their tastes or needs in return for things they want more urgently. Because it is virtually impossible for individuals or families to provide themselves with all the consumption requirements of even the simplest life, they usually find it profitable to engage in the activities for which they are best suited or have a comparative advantage in terms of their natural abilities or resource endowments. There are actually two traditional theory, but first let's tackle about the comparative advantage theory. It is the production of a commodity at a lower opportunity cost than any of the alternative commodities that could be produced. Furthermore, diverse preferences and needs as well as varied physical and financial endowments actually make trade economically profitable, and countries specialize in products in which they have a comparative advantage in terms of their natural abilities. Actually, the phenomenon of a specialization based on comparative advantage arises. Therefore, to some extent, in even the most primitive of subsistence economies. What is this specialization? It is actually the concentration of resources in the production of relatively few commodities. Now let's proceed to the principle of comparative advantage theory. The principle of comparative advantage, as it is called, asserts that a country should, and under competitive conditions, will specialize in the export of products that it can produce at the lowest relative cost. The concept of relative cost and price differences is actually basic to the theory of international trade. Germany may be able to produce cameras and cars, as well as fruits and vegetables absolute unit costs and lower absolute unit costs than Kenya. But because the commodity cost differences between countries are greater for the manufactured goods than for agricultural products, it will be to Germany's advantage to specialize in the production of manufactured goods and exchange them for Kenya's agricultural produce. So, even though Germany may have an absolute advantage in the cost of both commodities, its comparative cost advantage lies in manufactured goods. Conversely, Kenya may be at an absolute disadvantage Germany in both manufacturing and agriculture, in that its absolute unit cost of production are higher for both types of products. What is this absolute advantage? It is the production of a commodity with the same amount of real resources as another producer, but at a lower absolute unit cost. Now let's move on to the factor endowments trade theory. It enables us to describe analytically the impact of economic growth on trade patterns and the impact of trade on the structure of national economies and on the differential returns or payments to various factors of production. Unlike the classical labor cost model, however, where trade arises because of fixed but differing labor productivities of different commodities in different countries, the neoclassical factor endowment model assumes away inherent differences and relative labor productivity by postulating that all countries have access to the same technological possibilities for all commodities. The modification of the comparative advantage theory to account for differences in factor supplies, in essence, land, labor, capital between countries. On the other hand, trade arises from this theory is actually technological differences, in essence, different labor productivity levels. Given, given relative factor endowments, relative factor prices will differ. Example given, labor will be relatively cheap in labor-abundant countries, and so will domestic commodity price ratios and factor combinations. Countries with cheap labor will have a relative cost and price advantage over countries with relatively expensive labor in commodities that make intensive use of labor. Example given, primary products. Conversely, countries well endowed with capital will have a relative cost and price advantage in the production of manufactured goods, which tend to require relatively large inputs of capital compared with labor. To summarize, the factor endowment theory is based on two crucial propositions. What are these? The first one is different products require productive factors in different relative proportions. For example, agricultural products generally require relatively greater proportions of labor per unit of capital than manufactured goods, which require more machine time per worker than most primary products. The second one is countries have different endowments of factors of production. Some countries like the United States have large amounts of capital per worker and are therefore designated capital abundant countries. The factor endowment theory goes on to argue that capital abundant countries will tend to specialize in such products as automobiles, aircraft, sophisticated electronics, communication goods, and computers, which use capital intensively in their technology of production. This theory actually played a predominant role in the early literature and policy advice on trade and development, encouraged developing countries to focus on their labor and land-intensive primary product exports. Now let's look at the figure 12.1, the mechanism whereby the benefits of trade are transmitted across national boundaries under the factor endowment approach is analogous to that of the classical labor cost approach. However, in the factor endowment case, with the possibility of differing factor combinations for producing different commodities, nations are assumed to be operating initially at some point under concave or increasing opportunity cost production possibility front layer determined by domestic demand conditions. Let's have an example. Consider the standard two-country to commodity model. Let the two countries be less developed world and rest of world. The two commodities be agricultural goods and manufactured goods. As you can see in the figure 12.1 portrays the theoretical benefits of free trade with less developed world's domestic no trade. Production possibility front tire shown in figure 12.1a and rest of world's front tire in figure 12.1b. Point A on the less developed world production possibility front tire PP in figure 12.1a provides the illustration. The lines A in both graphs in figure 12.1 denote the common world price ratio. For less developed world, this steeper slope of means that it can get more of manufactured goods for a unit of agriculture than in the absence of trade. That is, the world price of agricultural goods in terms of manufacturers is higher than less developed world's domestic price ratio. In other words, a unit of agricultural goods sells at price twice that of a unit of manufactured goods. This means that for every unit of agriculture that less developed world exports the rest of world, it can import 2 units of manufactured goods. The slope of the international price line graphically portrays this trading ratio, these terms of trade. If less developed world exports BD agriculture, say 30 units, it will receive DC manufactures, which is 60 units in return. Similarly, for rest of world, the U international price ratio means more agricultural products in exchange for manufactured goods than at domestic prices. Graphically, the international price ratio has a lesser slope than rest of world's domestic price ratio, as you can see in figure 12.1b. Rest of world will therefore reallocate its abundant capital resources so as to produce more manufactured goods and less agriculture, as at point B, where its relative domestic production costs are just equal to relative world prices. On figure 12.1, the main conclusions of the neoclassical model of free trade are that 1. All countries gain from trade, and 2. World output is increased. However, there are several others in addition to these 2 basic conclusions. First, due to increasing opportunity costs associated with resource shifting among commodities with different factor intensities of production, complete specialization will not occur as in the classical comparative advantage model. Countries will tend to specialize in products that use their abundant resources intensively. Second, given identical technologies of production throughout the world, the equalization of domestic product price ratios with the international free trade price ratio will tend to factor price equalization across trading countries. Wage rates, for example, will rise in labor abundant, less developed world as a result of the more intensive use of human resources in the production of additional agricultural output. But the price of scarce capital will decline due to the diminished production of manufactured goods, which are heavy users of capital. Third, within countries, the factor endowment theory predicts that the economic return to owners of the abundant resources will rise in relation to owners of scarce of resources, as the abundant factor is more intensively used. In developing countries, this would generally mean a rise in the share of national income going to labor. In the absence of trade, labor's share might be smaller. Thus, trade tends to promote more equality in domestic income distributions. Lastly, by enabling countries to move outside their production possibility frontiers and secure capital as well as consumption goods from other parts of the world, trade is assumed to stimulate economic growth. If developed countries have the comparative advantage in producing higher skilled capital goods, trade would lower the price of equipment and machinery and stimulate investment and growth for developing countries. Okay, do you remember the 5 basic questions tackled by the first reporter about trade and development? We are now in the position to summarize the theoretical answers. The first one is trade. The first answer to the first question is trade is an important stimulator of economic growth. It enlarges a country's consumption capacities, increases world output, and provides access to scarce resources and worldwide markets products without which poor countries would be unable to grow. The second one is trade tends to promote greater international and domestic equality by equalizing factor prices, raising real incomes of trading countries, and making efficient use of each nation's and resourcing and the world's resource endowments rather. Example, raising relative wages in labor abundant countries and lowering them in labor scarce countries. The third one is trade helps countries achieve development by promoting and rewarding the sectors of the economy where individual countries possess a comparative advantage, whether in terms of labor efficiency or factor endowments. It also lets them take advantage of take advantage of economies of scale. The fourth one is in the world of free trade, international prices and cost of production determine how much a country should trade in order to maximize its national welfare. Countries should follow the principle of comparative advantage and not try to interfere with the free workings of the market through government policies that either promote exports or restrict imports. Finally, to promote growth and development, an outward-looking international policy is required in all cases. Self-reliance based on partial or complete isolation is asserted to be economically inferior to participation in a world of unlimited free trade.
The critic of traditional theory. So the conclusions of traditional international trade theory are derived from a number of assumptions that are often contrary to the reality of contemporary international economic relations. So what are these basic assumptions? First, all productive resources are fixed in quantity and constant in quality across nations and are fully employed. So this refers to the factors of production, which is essential to growth, such as physical capital, skilled labor, and technological research. But these, in reality, are not fixed either in quantity or in quality. Because as you can observe in rich nations, they are well endowed with these vital resources, and they specialize in highly profitable production processes. While in poor nations, it's the opposite. They have large supplies of unskilled labor, and they also specialize in less profitable activities. Second assumption is the technology of production is fixed or similar and freely available to all nations. The spread of technology works to the benefit of all. Technological improvement led to massive productivity growth, but in reality, only those economies with improved technology are primary beneficiaries of productivity growth. Third assumption, within nations, factors of production are perfectly mobile between different production activities, and the economy as a whole is characterized by the existence of perfect competition. There are no risks or uncertainties. However, in reality, reallocation of resources among industries is difficult to achieve since it is very costly, especially in developing economies, due to two factors. First, rigid economic and social infrastructure such as roads, railways, and power locations. Second, largely restricted factor movement such as cumulative capital investment sunk in existing infrastructure over time. Fourth assumption is national governments play no role in international economic relations, and international prices determined by demand and supply. Activist government intervention via industrial policy to create a comparative advantage where the demand is likely to rise in the future. So government used tools of commercial policy such as tariff, quotas, and subsidies to influence commodity prices. Next topic is about fixed resources, full employment, and the international immobility of capital and skilled labor. So trade and resource growth, we have North-South model of unequal trade. So this model focuses on the unequal exchange between the North developed countries and the South developing countries in an attempt to explain why the South gains less from trade than the North. So this emphasizes the process of factor accumulation and uneven development. So this assumption that resources are fixed, fully utilized, and internationally immobile is central to the traditional theory. But in reality, the world economy changes. It is characterized by a rapid change, and these factors of production are neither fixed in quantity nor fixed in quality. That's why there's this unequal exchange between the North and the South. Unemployment and resource underutilization. So under this, we have vent for surplus theory of international trade, which is the contention that opening world markets to developing countries through international trade allows those countries to make better use of formerly underutilized land and labor resources to produce larger primary product output in which the surpluses can be exported. So this is first formulated by Adam Smith. So this assumption of full employment in traditional trade model violates the reality of unemployment and underemployment in developing nations. That's why the vent for surplus theory of international trade recognizes that the opening of world market creates opportunities not to reallocate fully employed resources, but to make use of the underemployed resources to produce greater output for export. Fixed, freely available technology and consumer sovereignty. Technological change impacts developing countries' world trading relationships and their export earnings. So one example of the impact of this is the development of synthetic substitute. So this is the commodity that are artificially produced but can be substituted for the natural commodity. Examples are manufactured rubber, cotton, wool, etc. So the worldwide availability of new technologies gave opportunities to newly industrializing countries by imitating the product, while middle-income countries can follow the product cycle of international trade. So what is product cycle? This is the progressive replacement of more developed countries by less developed countries in the production of manufactures of increasing complexity. So this strategy used lower wages and moving from low-tech to high-tech production, and their hope is to catch up with the developed countries. So China used this strategy and they made a striking progress. Next topic is about internal factor mobility, perfect competition and uncertainty, increasing returns, imperfect competition, and issues in specialization. So this assumption that nations are readily able to adjust their economic structure to fit the international market is not realistic, because in reality, reallocation are difficult to achieve as production structure and factor movements are readily restricted, especially in developing countries. So what is returns to scale? So this refers to how much output expands when all inputs are proportionately increased. So increasing returns to scale will result to decreasing cost of production. This means that large firms are able to underprice smaller or new firms and thus exert monopolistic control. So what is monopolistic and oligopolistic market control? Monopolistic market control is a situation in which the output of an industry is controlled by a single producer or seller or by a group of producers who make joint decisions, while oligopolistic market control is a situation in which a small number of rival but not necessarily competing firms dominate an industry. This means that large firms are able to manipulate prices and supplies for their own private interest. So let's define these terms. First is increasing returns. This is a disproportionate increase in output that results from a change in the scale of production. while product differentiation is an attempt by producers to distinguish their product from similar ones through advertising or minor design changes. So focusing in these two, large firms and rich nations are able to take advantage of this, increasing return and product differentiation to have their dominant position in the world market. Next is risk. This is a situation in which the probabilities of the various possible outcomes are known, but the actual outcome is not known. And uncertainty is a situation in which neither the actual outcome nor even the precise probability of the various possible outcomes are known. So these two, risk and uncertainty, are considered as one of the limitations of the perfectly competitive assumption. The absence of national governments in trading relations. What is growth poles? This refers to regions that are more economically and socially advanced than others around them, such as urban centers versus rural areas in developing countries. These can be modified by government through legislation, taxes, transfer payment, and so on. But since there is no effective international government to play that role, the result is highly uneven gains from trade. What is industrial policy? This is a deliberate effort by governments to guide the market by coordinating and supporting specific industrial activity. So this is designed to achieve comparative advantage, and governments may also employ various instruments such as tariff, import quota, and export subsidies. So what is tariff? This is a fixed percentage tax on the value of an imported commodity levied at the point of entry into the importing country. While quota, in international trade, is a physical limitation on the quantity of any item that can be imported into a country. And subsidy is a payment by the government to producers or distributors in an industry for such purposes as preventing the decline of that industry, expanding employment, increasing exports, or reducing selected prices paid by consumers. Gains from trade. This is the increase in output and consumption resulting from specialization in production and free trade with other economic units, including persons, regions, or countries. So governments often serve to reinforce the unequal distribution of resources, and these gains from trade in richer countries, their governments can influence world economic affairs by their international policies. But in least developed countries, there is no world government that protect and promote the interests of these weaker parties. Balanced trade and trade gains accruing to nationals. So what is balanced trade? This is a situation in which the value of a country's export and the value of its import are equal. So in here, there is no international capital movement and balance of payment problem never arise. Enclave economies. These refer to small economically developed regions in developing countries in which the remaining areas have experienced much less progress. So this happens because foreigners pay very low rent for the right to use the land. They bring in their own foreign capital and skilled labor, and they hire local unskilled workers at subsistence wages. Foreign exchange earnings. This is the sum total of all foreign currency receipt less expenditure during a given fiscal year. So this provides an important stimulus to aggregate economic growth.
Now, we arrive at the fifth subtopic of this chapter, and I, Jade Marie M. Obinario, will discuss this subtopic up to the last. So the fifth subtopic of this chapter is traditional trade strategies for development, export promotion versus import substitution. A traditional way to approach the complex issues of appropriate trade policies for development is to set these specific policies in the context of a broader strategy of looking outward and looking inward. So what is this outward looking and inward looking? So outward looking development policies are policies that encourage exports often through the free movement of capital, workers, enterprises, and students. It is a welcome to multinational corporations and open communications. On the other hand, inward looking development policies are policies that stress economic self reliance on the part of developing countries, including domestic development of technology, the imposition of barriers to imports, and the discouragement of private foreign investment. Basically, the distinction between the two traditional trade-related development strategies is that advocates of import substitution and export promotion. So import substitution is a deliberate effort to replace consumer imports by promoting the emergence and expansion of domestic industries, while export promotion is the governmental efforts to expand the volume of a country's exports through increasing export incentives, decreasing disincentives in other means in order to generate more foreign exchange and improve the current account of its balance of payments or achieve other objectives. Export promotion of both primary and manufactured goods cite the efficiency of growth benefits of free trade and competition, the importance of substituting large world markets for narrow domestic markets, the distorting price and cost effects of production, and the tremendous success of such export oriented economies as South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, China, and others in Asia. They stress that firms in these economies have learned a great deal from the firms in the United States, Japan, and other developed countries' economies that have been their long term customers. Import substitution believe that a developing economy should initially substitute domestic production of previously imported simple consumer goods or the first stage of import substitution and then substitute through domestic production for a wider range of more sophisticated manufactured items. So it is the second stage of the import substitution, all behind the protection of tariffs and quotas on these imports. So in the long run, import substitution advocates cite the benefits of greater domestic industrial diversification and the ultimate ability to export some previously protected manufactured goods as economies of scale, low labor costs, and the positive externalities of learning by doing cost domestic prices to become more competitive with the world prices. So, the basic theory of protection is an old and controversial issue in the field of international trade. So, in this illustration, the top portion shows the standard domestic supply and demand curves for the industry in question if there were no international trade. That is a closed economy. The equilibrium home price and quantity would be P1 and Q1, the one with the broken line. So if this country were then to open its economy world trade, its small size in relation to the world market would mean that it would have a horizontal, perfectly elastic demand curve. In other words, it could sell or buy all it wanted at a lower price, or the P2. So domestic consumers would benefit from the lower price of imports and the resultant greater quantity purchased, while the domestic producers and their employees would clearly suffer as they lost business to lower cost foreign suppliers. So thus at the lower world price, the P2, the quantity demanded rises from Q1 to Q3, whereas the quantity supplied by the domestic producers fall from Q1 to Q2. So the difference between what domestic producers are willing to supply at the lower world price and what consumers want to buy is the amount that will be imported. The industrialization strategy approach to export policy. So the industrialization strategy approach began primarily as an empirical literature but has developed a theory to help explain why an interventionist strategy towards exports can accelerate growth and improve development outcomes more than a strict free trade approach. So the theories developed in this approach are focused primarily on identifying and redressing market failures encountered in the process of industrialization. So, this strain of research has revealed that rather than operating on a market basis, at least 4 of 5 the leading export oriented East Asian economies that are now high in income, in fact, had a very active government interventions to encourage industrial exports and to attempt to move up to the ladder of comparative advantage toward more advanced products, generating higher value added by higher skills and higher technology. So another issue is whether in what degree the World Trade Organization rules permit such government to do so. So, although in general support for all industries that does not discriminate is permitted, and such support continues to be practiced by economies sufficiently advanced and the government sufficiently to do so, so such as Taiwan and South Korea. So some developing countries that might benefit from exporting strategically are not permitted to do so. So there are, however, some important exceptions to these rules, notably for the least developed countries. So there are some gray areas. So governments may build infrastructure, and to a degree, this can be industry specific. So, governments can assist an emerging industry as long as it does not give domestic firms a significant advantage over foreign firms. So, government can also promote some categories of foreign investment in selected sectors, specialized human capital formation, innovation priorities, and joint venture agreements. So, a third issue is whether other governments have the competence and political authority that South Korea did during its period of active industrial policy management. So, where it is lacking, advocates have argued that the World Bank and other agencies should help governments build this competence. But some observers argue that if government lack the needed skills, and are unable to get international assistance to develop the needed capabilities, they may ultimately be better off using less interventionist strategies. South South trade and economic integration looking outward and inward. The traditional theory of custom unions and economic integration focuses on the static resource and production reallocation effects. But the deeper economic rationale for the gradual integration of less developed economies is a long term dynamic one. So, integration provides the opportunity for industries that have not yet been established, as well as for those that have to take advantage of economies of large scale production made possible by the expanded markets. So there are also regional trading blocs or economic union that exist in certain countries. So the economic unions are the North American Free Trade Market Agreement, South Cone Common Market, the South African Development Community, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Trade policies of developed countries, the need for reform and resistance to new protectionist pressures. It is clear that a major obstacle to export expansion, whether in primary products or manufactures, has been the various trade barriers erected by developed nations against the principal commodity exports of developing countries. So, in the absence of economic integration, or even in support of that effort, the prospect for future trade and foreign exchange expansions depend largely on domestic and international economic policies of developed nations. So, developed country economic and commercial policies are the most important from the perspective of future developing country foreign exchange earnings in the three major areas. So tariff and non-tariff barriers to their exports, adjustment assistance for displaced workers in developed country industries hurt by freer access to labor intensive low cost developing country exports, and the general impact of rich country domestic economic policies on developing economies. So the overall effect of developed country tariffs, quotas, and non-tariff barriers has been to lower the effective price received by the developing countries for their exports, reduce the quantity exported, and diminish foreign exchange earnings. So the two international disputes are the 1995 Uruguay Round and the 2001 Doha Round. So the Uruguay Round Agreement of 1995 substantially reduced tariff and non-tariff trade barriers in many sectors. So it also established the Geneva-based World Trade Organization to replace the 47-year-old General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, while the current round of negotiations were dubbed as the Doha Development Round. Doha for the city and Qatar, in which agreement on the agenda was reached in November 2001, and development for the commitment to focus much more on the needs and aspirations of the developing world in this round of trade agreements. So whether this goal is ultimately achieved remains to be seen, but these talks have been at a protected impasse. So the graph illustrated shows the effective tariff faced by income groups in 1997 to 1998. So at the household level, the World Bank reported that the effective trade-weighted tariffs faced by the poor are much higher than those faced by the non-poor. Both those living on less than $1 a day and those living between $1 and $2 a day faced effective tariffs of well over 14%, while those with higher incomes of over $2 a day face trade-weighted tariffs of only just over 6% on average. And that's all for Chapter 12, International Trade Theory and Development Strategy. Thank you for watching and listening. Have a nice day ahead.